Every relationship of a person is based on the pillar of trust, whether it's between parents and children, husband and wife, or even between boyfriend and girlfriend. But if someone breaks the trust of another person in these essential relationships and starts thinking badly about them, it feels really terrible. And today's case is somewhat similar, where a boy and a girl from Pakistan were very happy in their relationship. But then, after some time, the girl breaks up because she started seeing a dark side of her boyfriend. But then, what the boy did with his girlfriend shook the entire Pakistan. Shaukat Ali Mukadam was not only a normal citizen of Pakistan, but also a diplomat and ambassador of Pakistan. Due to this, he had to live in different countries. However, in 2021, he was living in Islamabad, Pakistan. Apart from this, at one point, Shaukat Ali had also been Pakistan's ambassador to South Korea and Kazakhstan. Because of this, he held a very high position in Pakistan. There were a total of 5 people in his family, including Shaukat Mukadam, his wife Kausar Mukadam, 2 daughters and 1 son. October 23, 1993, was the day when a beautiful girl was born in Shaukat Ali's house, whom they named Nure. Nure was a healthy and cute baby who always laughed and never bothered anyone too much. Although Shaukat's professional life was very busy and stressful, but when he came home, he spent quality time with his family. As a result, his children had a very good upbringing. From school days, Nure had a great interest in studying. She always used to read either school books or other books. Now, because Shaukat Mukadam was a diplomat, he used to get transferred to other countries due to his work, which is why Nure started her schooling from Ireland. Then she completed high school from South Korea. After South Korea, the family moved to Kazakhstan, but Nure thinks about completing her college in the US, where her older sister Sarah also lived. However, after the US, Nure returned to Pakistan, Islamabad. As humble and smart as Nure was in her childhood, she was equally humble and smart in her adult years. That's why everyone at home trusted Nure and easily accepted her decisions. Besides, Nure loved animals, especially stray dogs and cats. She used to feed them whenever she had time. Although Nure belonged to a wealthy family, she never had a liking for materialistic things. By hearing all these things, you must have understood that Nure was a kind-hearted, down-to-earth, intelligent and confident girl. Along with all these things, Nure also had a great passion for art and calligraphy. She often made religious paintings too. As I mentioned, coming from a wealthy diplomat family, parties were a common occurrence at the diplomats' homes. So Shaukat Mukadam often took his family to such parties because they were excellent for networking and building connections. It was at one such party in 2018 that Nure met a boy named Zahir Jaffer. Zahir and Nure are both going to be key characters in this case. So before we proceed, let's take a brief look at Zahir's background. Zahir Jaffer was born in the USA, but he spent his childhood and teenage years in Pakistan. After that, Zahir pursued his graduation in the US and also spent some time living in the UK. Zahir's father was Zahir Jaffer, who was a very successful businessman. Due to his father's business ventures, the Jaffer family was one of the wealthiest families in Pakistan. The Jaffer family had various businesses, including healthcare, oil, real estate, and construction. This also provided them with opportunities to work with their country's military. One of these companies is Ahmed Jaffer and Company, where Zahir Jaffer is now the CEO, while his father, Zahir Jaffer, used to oversee the company. But after some time, Zahir's mood changed, and he started working as a therapist at a company called Therapy Works. In this company, Zahir used to listen to the children of the school and explain to them about mental health care. He also used to arrange lectures and presentations for the children. But the shocking thing here is that Zahir himself was an introverted and angry since childhood. He also had very few friends, and he rarely attended parties with them. But it is at one such party that he meets Nure, and he likes her, and Nure also enjoys talking to Zahir. Perhaps this happened because their personalities were different, and people say that opposite personalities are attracted to each other. However, both their families already knew each other because they used to attend such parties. but friendship between Nure and Zahir developed from this party. Then, after some time, this friendship turned into love, and they both entered into a romantic relationship. However, it's not like they kept this fact hidden from their parents or friends. Rather, both their families and friends knew that Zahir and Nure were dating. Both families were happy because Nure completes Zahir and Zahir completes Nure. Actually, Nure brought out a side of Zahir that no one had seen before, whereas Zahir used to be very introverted before. But as soon as he met Nure, his personality began to change gradually. He started enjoying his life, hanging out with people, and at one party, people were surprised to see Zahir dancing with Nure, including Zahir's family, because they had never thought they would see this side of Zahir's personality. Everything was going well, but as the relationship grew older, things started to deteriorate. Initially, everything was going well in the relationship. Both were enjoying themselves, and their families were also very happy. But then, after some time, a different side of Zahir came out in front of Nure. Actually, Nure later finds out that Zahir is a very aggressive and abusive man. Allegedly, Zahir had physically and mentally abused Nure several times. Not only that, Zahir had also raised his hand against his own mother before. As a result, after almost 3 years of relationship, when Nure couldn't bear Zahir anymore, she broke up with him at the beginning of 2021. In both families, there was dissatisfaction over their children ending the relationship. Because neither of them was a normal family, and in such affluent households, it's not typical for a boy and a girl to enter a relationship, break up shortly after, and then enter into a relationship with someone else later. In fact, people like them also see relationships as a business. Like most wealthy families, they marry off their sons or daughters where they can profit. But besides that, Zahir was also displeased that Nure left him, and now he took it as an affront to his male ego. However, after some time, Zahir also started thinking about moving on, and then he thought he would go back to the US and settle there because he also had US citizenship along with Pakistani citizenship. Now let's jump to July 18th, 2021. On this day, Zahir booked a taxi to go to Islamabad International Airport. Actually, according to Pakistan Standard Time, Zahir's flight to New York was at 3:50 a.m. on July 19th. He had already packed his bags and informed his family about it. But before leaving, he wanted to meet Nure just once, so he called Nure on the evening of July 18th. At that time, Nure was at her home, preparing for Eid with her family. Now, Zahir called Nure and requested, "I am leaving this country for New York, and I will never come back here again, but I will settle in the US, so please meet me once before I leave." Additionally, Zahir told Nure, "Come to my house, we'll meet, and then when I leave for the airport from my house, I'll drop you off at your home first." Although these two had already broken up, before that they had been in a relationship for 3 years, which led Nure to say yes to meeting Zahir. After that, at 9:05 p.m., Nure leaves her house. But she doesn't tell her family that she's going to Zahir's house. She just says she's going to her friend's house and will be back soon. Around 10 p.m., Nure arrives outside Zahir's house at the sent location in Sector F74. But strange things start happening from here. Now, as I told you, Zahir's flight was at 3:50 a.m., but between 10 and 11 p.m., Zahir calls his travel agency multiple times. Zahir called his travel agency and started asking them very strange questions like, "What would happen if I don't board this flight? Will I get my refund back? If I decide to book tickets again after 10 days, what will happen?" Sometime later, Zahir called his travel agency again and said that now I'm not canceling my ticket, but I've decided to go to the US on this flight. But let me tell you, during this time, Nure was inside his house with him. But for her, this house was a new place because she had never been here before. Afterward, the taxi that Zahir had booked to go to the airport also arrives outside Jaffer's house at exactly 11 p.m. However, Zahir doesn't come out of the house for half an hour. Meanwhile, the taxi driver called Zahir 2 or 3 times, but Zahir told him to wait, saying, "I'll be there in just 5 minutes." However, at 12:07 a.m., he calls the taxi driver again and says, My plan to go to the airport is cancelled now. Anyway, if we leave for the airport now, I won't be able to catch my flight. Despite waiting for more than an hour, Zahir pays the taxi driver half the fare. Actually, Zahir had booked this taxi for 2,000 Pakistani rupees. Now, after that, the taxi driver leaves from there. But at 1:40 a.m., Zahir calls the taxi driver again and asks him to come back to his house. Now, the taxi driver also returns to Zahir's house because he knew he would get the full payment. But this time too, Zahir made the taxi driver wait outside the house for a few minutes, and then at 2:15 a.m., Zahir comes out with his luggage. But the strange thing this time was that Nure was also with him, and she didn't have sandals on her feet, which the driver found very strange. However, what struck him as even strange was that Zahir was talking to Nure during the car ride, but Nure wasn't responding to his words. Although the driver didn't pay much attention to this at the time, halfway through, Zahir told the driver, "Now take the car back towards home anyway. We're already very late. I don't think we'll make it to the airport on time and catch the flight." After that, the taxi driver drops them off again at Jaffer's house at 2:35 a.m. But as soon as Nure got out of the taxi, Zahir pulled her inside the house. According to the taxi driver's statement, he felt like Nure wasn't supposed to go back inside the house with Zahir, but Zahir forcefully took her inside. Then, on July 19th, Nure stayed at Zahir's house the whole day, and then July 20th arrived, which was the day of Eid. Nure had come to Zahir's house to meet him on July 18th at 9:05 p.m., but now it had been more than 24 hours, and Nure's father and mother had returned home after shopping for Eid. But when they find out that their daughter has been missing from home for 24 hours, at 12:57 a.m. on July 20th, Nure Mukadam texts his daughter, asking her where she is. However, Nure doesn't reply to that text message. Then, at 5:48 a.m., Nure's mother messages her, and two family friends also call Nure, yet there is no response from Nure. This causes worry for Nure's parents, and they were about to inform the police about it. But at 10:43 a.m., Nure sends a voice recording to her mother. However, the contents of that recording were never made public, but it was the last time Nure's mother, Nure Mukadam, heard her daughter's voice. But after sending the voice message, another strange thing happens. Zahir immediately calls Nure's mother from his own phone and tells her that Nure is not at his house, trying to prove that he hasn't even seen Nure. Then, from 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. that same day, Zahir repeatedly calls his father, Zahir Jaffer. However, at around 7:10 p.m., Nure is seen on CCTV cameras. But by that time, her condition was very bad, and it seemed as though Zahir had tortured her severely. In the CCTV footage, Nure is seen jumping from the balcony of Zahir's house on the first floor and falling directly onto an iron grill. This caused her to sustain an injury to her abdomen, which is why she is seen holding her stomach in this clip. She was actually distressed by Zahir's harassment and wanted to leave the house. However, the security guard closed the gate, and meanwhile Zahir also jumps from the balcony to catch Nure and brings her back inside. But as he was bringing her back, Nure falls down, but Zahir drags her inside. Now, I should tell you that it wasn't just Zahir and Nure inside the house. There was also a security guard, a cook, and a gardener. But none of them helped Nure. In fact, from July 18th to July 20th, Nure attempted to escape from this house 6 times. But each time, one of Zahir's servants informed him, and Nure was always caught. But this time, because of Nure's attempt to escape, Zahir becomes very angry. After bringing Nure back inside, he calls his father once again around 7:30 p.m. But since then, Zahir didn't call anyone for 30 minutes, because in the meantime, Zahir first attempts to shoot Nure with his handgun, but as soon as he presses the trigger, his gun jams. However, even after that, Zahir doesn't stop wanting to kill Nure. It was already in his mind. So he takes out a Swiss knife and starts stabbing every part of Nure's body. Meanwhile, Nure scratches Zahir's face and arms with her nails, but after some time, Nure's condition deteriorates so much that she faints. Nure was unconscious, but even then, Zahir kept stabbing her with the knife. Afterward, he grabs Nure by the throat and keeps squeezing until Nure's last breath is gone. Later, Nure's post-mortem report reveals that she died due to lack of oxygen, but before killing Nure, Zahir ripped her several times. But Zahir didn't stop there. After Nure's death, he pulled out his knife and started cutting Nure's throat, and finally, he severed her head from her body. After killing Nure, Zahir quickly calls his father and friends, saying, "Thieves have broken into our house, and I need help." At the same time, some of Zahir's friends head towards his house. However, Zahir's father wasn't there. That's why he called the CEO of the company where Zahir worked, named Therapy Works, and said, "Quickly go to my house and save my son at any cost." In reality, Zahir's father, Zahir Jaffer, called the CEO of that company because they needed to erase all evidence of Nure's murder by going to Zahir. Moreover, the CEO of the company had to comply because Zahir's father was funding the company. Around 8:30 p.m., Tahir Zahur, the CEO of Therapy Works, arrives outside Zahir's house with his 6 employees. Additionally, some of Zahir's friends were also present. However, the door of Zahir's house remained closed, so Tahir took a ladder and, with his employees, entered through the window on the first floor. But as soon as they reached the first floor, Zahir attacked one of the employees with a knife, piercing through his chin and tongue. Zahir was extremely angry at that moment, so 5 to 6 people quickly grabbed him to control him. After this, Zahir's hands were tied behind his back, and ropes were also tied around his feet. But as soon as the people went inside Zahir's room from the balcony, they were stunned. In fact, there was blood everywhere on the floor, even on the walls of the room. Then they saw Nure's body in the center of the room, but her head was 3 feet away from her body. Now, everyone inside the room was astonished to regain control over Zahir, and after seeing Nure's dead body. But in the meantime, the neighbors were also quite alert, because when Zahir was being caught, he was screaming a lot, which made his neighbors call the police. After that, the police arrived there, and then on July 20th, around 10 o'clock at night, the police called Nure Mukadam to inform him that his daughter had been murdered. Hearing this sad news, Mukadam's family home was engulfed in mourning because their youngest and dearest daughter was no longer in this world. But Nure's family knew who had done all this, and now they wanted to punish Zahir according to Pakistan law, meaning the death penalty. After that, the police arrested Zahir, but now they were worried about how Zahir would confess his crime. But Zahir did something very strange here too. As soon as the police caught Zahir, he confessed in a short while that he was the one who had killed Nure, and he had done so because he loved Nure very much. He had even proposed marriage to Nure, but she had rejected his marriage proposal and later broke up with him. This hurt Zahir's ego, so he booked his and Nure's one-way tickets to New York for July 19th. But before this, Zahir had decided that if Nure agreed to go to New York with him, they would get married and settle in New York. But if Nure didn't agree, he would kill her. However, from July 18th to 20th, Zahir tried to convince Nure for marriage, but when Nure refused to marry him, Zahir finally assaulted her very brutally. Although all the servants in Zahir's house knew what Zahir did with Nure, none of them tried to stop him even once, not even daring to call the police, because they were afraid that if they did, Zahir would not spare them. Now, even though Zahir had confessed his crime in front of the police, when the case went to court, he was behaving strangely in court. Firstly, he entered the court looking disheveled as if he hadn't bathed for days. Besides, he shouted loudly in the courtroom, even abusing the judge. Furthermore, the police had to drag him into the court and out of the court forcefully. However, he was doing all these things to prove that he is mentally unstable, and because of this, he should be spared from the death penalty for the murder of Nure. If it were proven that Zahir is mentally unstable, then firstly, his punishment would be reduced, and secondly, he would escape the death penalty. Actually, Zahir had schizophrenia, and he wanted to take advantage of it by telling the court that he is mentally unfit. Actually, Schizophrenia is a serious mental illness in which a person is mostly lost in the world of imagination and knows very little about the real world. Because of this, he often behaves strangely. But when Zahir's medical examination was done, the report clearly stated that Zahir is mentally fit, and whatever he did with Nure, he did it consciously. But this made it clear that Zahir was an abuser and an aggressive person. Besides, there were many harassment cases against Zahir in both the US and Pakistan. In this case, during the ongoing trial in court, the entire Pakistan raised its voice for justice for Nure. Rallies and marches were held every day. As a result, on February 24, 2022, Nure received justice, and Zahir was sentenced to 2 death penalties, one for physically assaulting Nure and the other for her murder. Additionally, his 2 house staff, Iftikhar and Mohammed Jan, were also sentenced to 10 years in jail. Looking at the photos, you wouldn't know much, but Zahir was a powerful, tall, and aggressive man with whom a sweet and innocent girl, Nure, spent almost 48 hours. And those 48 hours were nothing less than hell for her. So with this, the Nure Mukadam murder case comes to an end right here. In the midst of winter, when families gather to celebrate peace and joy, a sinister shadow loomed over the picturesque town of Dover, Arkansas. It was December 1987, a time meant for festivity and love, but for one family, it became a scene of overwhelming horror. This is the chilling tale of the Christmas killer Ronald Gene Simmons, a man who transformed the season of giving into a time of unspeakable tragedy. But what leads a person to destroy what they once cherished? What darkness lies within the human mind that can turn a father into a monster? From decorated war hero to a man convicted of the worst family massacre in American history, we'll delve into the depths of a mind clouded by secrets and rage, where the line between protector and predator became fatally blurred. To understand the mind behind the massacre, we must journey back to the origins of Ronald Gene Simmons. His story begins not with violence, but with a seemingly ordinary life, marked by service and family. Ronald Gene Simmons was born on July 15, 1940, in Chicago, Illinois. His father died of a stroke when Ronald was 3. His mother got married again in less than a year to a civil engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who was transferred to Arkansas. Little is known about Simmons's early childhood, but it was a life that took a turn towards discipline and commitment when Ronald dropped out of school and enlisted in the United States Navy in 1957, and later the U.S. Air Force. Simmons served with distinction. Over a 22-year career, he received several commendations, including the Bronze Star Medal, the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross, and the Air Force Ribbon for excellent marksmanship. But behind the facade of a decorated military man, there were undercurrents of turmoil. Simmons married Rebecca Ulibarri in 1960 in New Mexico, and together they had 7 children. However, the veneer of a normal family life was shattered in 1981 when allegations emerged that Simmons had been assaulting his 15-year-old daughter, Sheila, and had fathered a child with her. Fearing prosecution, Simmons uprooted his family, moving them from New Mexico to a desolate 13-acre tract of land in Pope County, 6.5 miles north of Dover, Arkansas, known as Mockingbird Hill. This property, isolated and ringed with a makeshift fence, up to 10 feet tall, became a fortress of sorts, a place where Simmons could exert total control. The residents didn't have a phone or indoor plumbing. But what was it that drove a man of discipline and service to the edge of such darkness? Was it the fear of losing control over his family, the desperation to conceal his illicit acts, or something deeper, a more sinister aspect of his psyche yet to be revealed? The facade of the family man began to crumble, revealing a tyrannical figure, ruling his household with an iron fist. The family, once a symbol of joy and unity, became prisoners in their own home. This descent into tyranny was but a prelude to the horror that would unfold, unraveling the chilling transformation of Ronald Gene Simmons from a respected military man to one of the most notorious mass murderers in American history. In November 1979, Simmons retired from the Air Force and military service. He did some low-paying jobs in the nearby town of Russellville, Arkansas. He worked as an accounts receivable clerk at Woodline Motor Freight, but had to resign after multiple reports of inappropriate sexual advances. He worked for about a year and a half at a Sinclair mini-mart, but had to quit on December 18, 1987, because of low wages. Two of the elder children, Billy and Sheila, had moved out, got married, and started their own families. So by the time of the murders, there were only 7 people living in the house. The calm of the holiday season in 1987 was shattered in Dover, Arkansas, by a series of heinous crimes. Ronald Gene Simmons' descent into murderous madness began shortly before Christmas, on December 22nd. The Simmons family home, once a haven of domestic life, turned into a chilling stage for an unthinkable act. Ronald Gene Simmons, armed with a .22 caliber pistol, commenced a killing spree that would become the worst family massacre in American history. His first victims were his wife, 46-year-old Rebecca, and eldest son, 26-year-old Ronald Jr., bludgeoned with a crowbar and shot. And he strangled Ronald Jr.'s daughter and his granddaughter, 3-year-old Barbara. Their demise was just the beginning. Simmons lay in wait for his other children, feigning a festive spirit, only to mercilessly end their lives. One by one, later that day, the Dover school bus dropped off the younger kids for their Christmas break from school. In a macabre ritual, Simmons systematically strangled and drowned his younger children, displaying a level of brutality that defies comprehension. The youngest victims, mere toddlers, met a similar fate, their innocence stolen in the most atrocious way. Simmons told them he had gifts for each of them, which he wanted to give one at a time, then strangled them and held under the water in a rain barrel. First to receive her gift was his eldest daughter, 17-year-old Loretta. His 3 other children, 14-year-old Eddie, 11-year-old Marianne, and 8-year-old Becky, were murdered in the same brutal manner. He then dumped the bodies in one of the cesspits he had made his children dig days before. But the horror did not end there. On December 26th, as the rest of the world celebrated, Simmons' remaining family members arrived for a holiday visit, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. 23-year-old Simmons' son Billy, his 21-year-old daughter-in-law Renata, and their child were the next to fall victim to his unfathomable rage. Billy and Renata were both shot dead. Their bodies were left by the dining room table next to the decorated Christmas tree with unopened gifts and covered with their own coats and some bedding. Then their 20-month-old son, Trey, was strangled and drowned. The same fate befell his 24-year-old daughter, Sheila, her 33-year-old husband, Dennis, and their children. Simmons strangled his and Sheila's child, 6-year-old Sylvia, and finally, his 21-month-old grandson, Michael. The bodies were meticulously laid out, a grim tableau that defied any sense of humanity. He then covered their bodies with coats. Sheila's body was laid on the dining room table and covered with Rebecca Simmons' best tablecloth. He wrapped the bodies of Trey and Michael in plastic sheeting, and they were left in abandoned cars behind the Simmons home. Simmons then embarked on a chillingly ordinary series of errands, his actions a stark contrast to the carnage he had just inflicted. He drove to a Sears store in Russellville to pick up Christmas gifts previously ordered for his family. That night he went out for a drink at a local bar. When he returned home, he spent the night and the next day drinking beer and watching television surrounded by the dead bodies of his family. On December 28th, the killing spree spilled over into the town of Russellville. In the morning, Simmons drove a car that had belonged to his son, Ronald Jr., to a Walmart in Russellville and purchased a second firearm. Fueled by a mix of revenge and rage, Simmons targeted those he felt had wronged him. The violence was indiscriminate, claiming the lives of acquaintances and strangers alike. His former workplace, a law firm, became the stage for his continued rampage. 24-year-old Kathy Kendrick, a secretary who had rebuffed his advances, was his first victim. She was fatally shot. The brutality continued at the Taylor Oil Company, where he shot and wounded the 38-year-old owner, Russell Taylor, who was also the owner of Sinclair Mini Mark, from which Simmons had recently resigned. He also killed a complete stranger in the building and shot at another employee before exiting the building, but missed. In Sinclair Mini Mart, Simmons shot and wounded 2 more people. He then shot his former supervisor, 35-year-old Joyce Butts, twice, and wounded her in the office of Woodline Motor Freight. She survived and testified later that Simmons had yelled at her during a previous argument about wages. The entire rampage lasted 45 minutes. 2 people were killed and 4 wounded. Simmons' final act was as perplexing as it was chilly. He said to the secretary in Woodline Motor Freight, "I just wanted to kill Joyce. Just Joyce. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me." Simmons surrendered to police without resistance, his spree of violence concluding as abruptly as it had begun. But the most heinous of his crimes were yet to be discovered. Simmons sat silently in his cell and stared at the wall. He refused to speak to investigators or even his attorneys. He didn't say a word during the interrogation. But when he was asked about his family, Simmons' eyes got red and started to well up. His lips started to quiver. The police got suspicious. They couldn't reach his family, so 2 officers drove to the isolated home. The investigation began on the chilling grounds of the Simmons family home. Here, detectives encountered a scene that defied belief. Family members' bodies laid out with a chilling meticulousness. It was a tableau that spoke volumes about the mindset of the killer. In the aftermath of this unprecedented massacre, questions swirled. What drove a father, a husband, a war veteran to commit such unspeakable acts against his own family and community? And what can we learn from this tragedy to prevent such horrors in the future? In the wake of the horrific murders committed by Ronald Gene Simmons, law enforcement faced the daunting task of piecing together a puzzle that spanned both family tragedy and public rampage. As the probe widened to include Simmons' subsequent attacks in Russellville, the challenge for investigators was to understand the connection between the family murders and the seemingly random acts of violence that followed. The evidence gathered was overwhelming. Firearms, witness testimonies, and Simmons' own actions painted a picture of a man who, after committing an unspeakable act against his own family, sought to extend his vengeance to those he perceived had wronged him in the wider community. In a case that stunned even seasoned investigators, the question wasn't just who had committed these crimes, but why. What drives a man to annihilate his family and lash out at the world around him? The arrest of Ronald Gene Simmons brought an end to the immediate threat, but it was just the beginning of a quest for justice and understanding. The prosecution's task was to unravel the mind of Simmons, to present a narrative that could make sense of the senseless. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing details emerged. Allegations of abuse, control, and a life led under the tyranny of Simmons became the focus. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the dark portrait of a man who had lived a life of deception and brutality. In the courtroom, the full extent of his crimes would come to light, bringing some answers, but also leaving haunting questions about the nature of evil. What kind of man lurked behind the annihilation of his family and terrorizing a community? Simmons' life was marked by strict discipline and control, traits honed during his military career. But beneath the surface of this structured exterior lay a tumultuous inner world. Allegations of sexual assault within his family suggest deep-seated pathological behavior. Experts in criminal psychology often point to a history of abuse, either experienced or perpetrated, as a significant factor in the development of violent behavior. In Simmons' case, the blurring of boundaries within his own family, coupled with a need for dominance, may have contributed to his downward spiral. The isolation of the Simmons family at Mockingbird Hill paints a picture of a man intent on exerting absolute control. This isolation could have exacerbated existing mental health issues, creating a pressure cooker environment. What then triggered Simmons to turn to murder? The possibility of his wife seeking a divorce might have been the tipping point, challenging his authoritarian hold over his family. She had already tried to leave him on numerous occasions, but always returned. A family friend informed the police that Simmons' wife had been saving up money to divorce him when the murder happened. Simmons' wife had written to their son shortly before the killings. "I don't want to live the rest of my life with Dad. I am a prisoner here, and the kids too. Every time I think of freedom, I want out as soon as possible." Simmons' actions in Russellville suggest a broader rage directed not just at his family, but at anyone he perceived as a threat or who had rejected him. His targeting of individuals in the community indicates a blend of personal vendetta and displaced aggression. Yet the absence of any recorded mental illness diagnosis leaves us with more questions than answers. The depths of Simmons' mind remain, in many ways, a locked enigma. Could this tragedy have been averted? In exploring these questions, we confront the unsettling reality of how little we sometimes know about those closest to us. After the chilling massacre by Ronald Gene Simmons, the wheels of justice began to turn, bringing us to a courtroom where the grim details of his crimes would be laid bare. After a psychiatric evaluation, it was determined that he was sane and capable to stand trial. Simmons' trial was a focal point of national attention, a legal battle to seek justice for the unprecedented atrocity he had committed. The proceedings were swift, reflecting the urgency of a community seeking closure. In May 1988, Simmons stood trial for the murders outside his family, specifically the killings of Kathy Kendrick and Jim Chaffin. The evidence presented was overwhelming, leaving little doubt about Simmons' guilt. Simmons, who had acted with such brutality, now faced the consequences of his actions in a court of law. His demeanor in court was reported as defiant, a stark contrast to the calculated coldness of his crimes. On May 12, 1988, the verdict was delivered. Ronald Gene Simmons was found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection, plus 147 years. Remarkably, Simmons himself requested that no appeal be made on his behalf, saying, "To those who oppose the death penalty, in my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment. Because of this, he had to be separated from other prisoners on death row. His life was in danger, as they believed Simmons' refusal to appeal his death sentence was jeopardizing their prospects of escaping their own executions." The second trial for the murders of his 14 family members began in February 1989. Here, the prosecution delved into the harrowing details of the family massacre, painting a picture of a man driven by control and rage. During the trial, a shocking moment unfolded. Simmons lashed out in court, punching the prosecutor and attempting to seize a deputy's gun, an act that only added to his infamy. This happened after Simmons' letter to his daughter Sheila was introduced, in which Simmons said, "You have destroyed me, and you have destroyed my trust in you. I will see you in hell," after she had disclosed that he was her child's father to the police. On February 10, 1989, Simmons was found guilty of 14 counts of capital murder. The judge, undeterred by Simmons' outburst, handed down another death sentence. This rapid succession from trial to sentence was unprecedented, reflecting the severity of the crimes. The execution warrant for Simmons was signed by Arkansas Governor and later President Bill Clinton on May 31, 1990. All visitors, including legal counsel and clergy, were refused by Simmons. On June 25th, he died via the fatal injection method he had chosen in the Cummins unit. This was the shortest period from sentence to execution to death in U.S. history since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. His last words were, "Justice delayed finally be done is justifiable homicide." Nobody claimed his body, and he was buried in a common grave in Lincoln County, Arkansas. As we reflect on the legal proceedings against Ronald Gene Simmons, we are left to ponder the balance between justice and understanding. The case of Ronald Gene Simmons is a stark reminder of the potential for hidden dangers within our own homes, and it's crucial to recognize early warning signs. FBI profilers and psychologists suggest vigilance for certain behaviors, patterns of control, isolation, and abuse within a family. These can often be precursors to more violent actions. In cases like Simmons, where the perpetrator isolates the family, the intervention of external agencies becomes critical. Neighbors, friends, and relatives need to be attentive and proactive in reporting any suspicions. But perhaps the most profound lesson lies in understanding the human psyche. Simmons' case demonstrates the complex interplay of psychological factors that can lead to such extreme behavior. What led Ronald Gene Simmons to commit such heinous acts? The answer lies in a complex web of control, abuse, and psychological instability. His desire for dominance, coupled with deep-seated issues likely stemming from his abusive behavior within the family, set the stage for tragedy. Simmons' military discipline, juxtaposed with his chaotic personal life, created a volatile mix. The isolation and control he exerted over his family only fueled his capacity for violence. And when his authority was threatened, possibly by a looming divorce, it may have been the catalyst for the massacre. John Harris, one of Simmons' defense attorneys, said of his abused family, "I think he felt like they are going to take him out. He's going to take them out first." I think that was his mindset. Could anything have been done to prevent the carnage? In hindsight, the warning signs were there: isolation, abuse, and a man teetering on the edge. Timely intervention could perhaps have altered this tragic course. Simmons' story is a grim reminder that behind closed doors, within seemingly normal families, the seeds of tragedy can grow unnoticed. People feared him even back then in New Mexico. They said he was strange, unfriendly, antisocial. He didn't have much to say. A friend of his daughter's said, "He had a beer in his hand all the time. He had one little room he would stay in all the time. It was dark and seemed spooky, and it stunk." Attorney John Harris also said that there was more than one person to blame. If authorities had successfully arrested him back in 1981 on the basis of his daughter's sexual assault, the murders likely wouldn't have happened. However, prosecutors at the time said they had dropped the charges at the family's request. Ronald Gene Simmons' Christmas week killing spree is the worst mass murder committed by a single person in Arkansas history. What were the underlying reasons that made Simmons annihilate his whole family that once formed the core of his identity? Tell me in the comments. In the quiet, mundane life sometimes lie the most extraordinary and harrowing stories. The name of Velma Barfield forever changed the narrative of crime and punishment in the United States. Her life story reads like a tragedy that challenges our perception of evil. Known to many as the death row grandma, she became the first woman executed by lethal injection in the United States, the first woman to be executed after the death penalty's reinstatement in 1976, and also the first woman executed since 1962. But how did a wife, mother, and grandmother, once cherished and loved by those who knew her, transform into one of the most notorious figures in criminal history? Born in a time of economic despair, in the shadow of the Great Depression, Velma Margie Barfield came into the world on October 29, 1932, in Eastover, North Carolina, but was raised near Fayetteville. The second of 9 children, she witnessed a constant battle against poverty from the early age. In rural North Carolina, where life was governed by the rising and setting of the sun, Velma's family toiled on their small tobacco and cotton farm. Velma's father, Murphy Bullard, was a man worn down by the hardships of farm life. His temper was as volatile as the weather that dictated their fortunes. Velma claimed he was physically and sexually abusive to her and her sisters. However, other relatives disputed this. Velma's mother, Lily Bullard, bore the brunt of her husband's frustrations. In their world, love was a luxury they could hardly afford, leaving Velma and her siblings to navigate a childhood marked by emotional absence and the ever-present threat of violence. At a young age, Velma observed the financial differences between herself and her peers. That's when her first criminal activity started. She initially took small amounts of cash from her father to buy little things that she saw her classmates enjoying. Her petty thefts escalated to taking $80 from an elderly neighbor. When her father discovered that, he beat her severely, and Velma stopped stealing for the remainder of her childhood. Raised in a Christian household, young Velma found solace in the pages of her Bible, clinging to faith in the turmoil of her home life. This early introduction to religion was a constant amidst chaos. Yet, as she transitioned to adolescence, the psychological scars left by her upbringing would shape the woman she would later become. The world around was convulsed by World War II. The war, though distant, exacerbated the hardships faced by her family and deepened the fractures within. Velma, like many of her generation, was forced to grow up quickly. Her dreams and aspirations were often overshadowed by the pressing needs of survival and duty to family. Yet it was during this time that her resilience and tenacity began to shine through, qualities that would define her in both commendable and tragic ways. As Velma stepped into early adulthood, her desire for a life beyond the confines of her home grew stronger. She dreamed of escape. At the age of 17, she dropped out of school. The search for love and stability led Velma into the arms of Thomas Burke, a union that promised freedom, but instead brought new hardships. By 19, she had 2 children, a son, Ron, and a daughter, Kim. The family lived happily in Parkton, North Carolina, for over 15 years. Velma's life with Thomas seemed a hard-earned escape from the poverty and violence of her childhood. Everything changed in 1965 when Thomas got into a serious car crash and suffered head injuries. To cope with the intense pain and headaches caused by his injuries, he became a heavy drinker and drug user. His struggle with alcohol mirrored the demons of Velma's father, reigniting the traumas of her past. The cycle of abuse and neglect she vowed never to repeat began to encroach upon her own family. It was during these turbulent years that Velma's resilience was put to the ultimate test. The pressures of an unhappy marriage, the responsibilities of motherhood, and the patterns of her past weighed heavily on her soul. Velma started a job at a textile factory, but soon had to quit due to health problems. She underwent an urgent hysterectomy, which left her feeling insecure about her femininity. After the surgery, she suffered from debilitating back pain and turned to prescription drugs. What began as a means to cope soon spiraled into addiction that eroded her judgment and set the stage for the tragedies to come. Her journey was not a plunge, but a gradual descent, each step marked by an increasing desperation to maintain the illusion of control. On April 4, 1969, Velma had a fierce argument with her husband. Later that day, when she and the children were away, the house caught fire. Thomas, who remained inside, died from smoke inhalation, and the house was burned to the ground. Velma and the kids moved in with her parents. A few months after her husband's death, Velma started dating a widower, Jennings Barfield. They married in August 1970. One day, the couple had an argument, after which Jennings became mysteriously ill. On March 21, 1971, he died of a heart attack. Velma moved into her parents' home again. Soon after that, her father died of lung cancer. In the summer of 1974, her mother suffered severe stomach pain and was taken to the hospital. As she got better, she returned home. In August 1974, a man Velma was dating died in a car accident. On December 30th of the same year, her mother was taken to the hospital again with similar symptoms of a severe stomach illness. Doctors couldn't help her this time, nor could they diagnose her illness, and she died after 2 hours. No autopsy was performed. As mysterious deaths around Velma continued, her son, Ronnie Burke, said, "It's the saddest thing, but it seems like everybody my mother ever gets close to dies. How could the good Lord allow this to happen to a faithful Christian like Velma Barfield?" The financial strain of her addiction led to another unethical decision, forging checks to sustain her growing needs. But deceit has its price, and the trust within the community began to fray. Velma found herself trapped in a web of her own making. In 1975, she was convicted of 7 counts of writing bad checks and sentenced to 6 months in prison. However, she was released after serving 3 months. Upon her release in 1976, Velma took a job as a caretaker for the elderly. Initially, she worked for 94-year-old Montgomery Edwards and his 84-year-old wife Dolly in Lumberton, North Carolina. Montgomery fell ill and died on January 29, 1977. A few weeks later, in February, Dolly developed symptoms of a stomach illness similar to those of Velma's mother and died on March 1st. Velma then started looking after 76-year-old Record Lee, who had broken her leg. On June 4, 1977, Lee's husband, John Henry, began to suffer severe pains in his stomach and chest. Doctors diagnosed his condition as a severe stomach virus. He died later that month. Later, in 1977, Velma moved in with her boyfriend Roland Stewart Taylor, a relative of Dolly Edwards. He was a widower and tobacco farmer. One day, they were attending a Pentecostal revival meeting in Cumberland County. Suddenly, Stewart complained of severe stomach pain. He was taken to the hospital, where he died after a few days. The search for truth begins in the quietest of ways: a question, a doubt, a pressing need for answers. Suspicion grew in the hearts of those who had watched Stewart's health decline under mysterious circumstances. It was their persistence that first brought the authorities to Velma's doorstep, initiating a chain of events that would lead to shocking revelations. An autopsy was ordered. The investigation into Stewart Taylor's death was methodical. Each test, each interview, each piece of evidence added another layer of suspicion around Velma. In the world of criminal investigations, breakthroughs often come with a faint clue, a moment of intuition, a connection previously unseen. For the team pursuing justice for Stewart Taylor and the other victims, it came in the form of forensic evidence. Arsenic became the linchpin in unraveling the mystery, traces of which were found in Stewart's system. Before the autopsy results were declared, Lumberton police received an anonymous phone call, reportedly from Velma's sister, who said that Velma had poisoned Taylor and others. Subsequently, Velma was arrested on charges of murdering Stewart Taylor. After her arrest, the body of Jennings Barfield was exhumed, and traces of arsenic were found. The unraveling of Velma's carefully constructed lies began. The art of interrogation is delicate, a push and pull between investigator and suspect. Each question a probe into the darkest corners of the human heart. For Velma, the questions posed by her interrogators mirrored the ones she had long avoided within herself. It was in this room, under the weight of evidence and the scrutiny of the law, that the walls she had built to separate her actions from her conscience could no longer hold as the truth clawed its way to the surface. In search of solace, Velma turned to a spiritual advisor. It was in this desperate hope for redemption that she found the strength to confront her past. For her, the path to confession was a journey back to her soul. With a voice tinged with regret, Velma began to speak. A torrent of truths, long dammed by fear, shame, and denial, flowed forth. Her confession became a source of deep, lasting pain for her own family, who were unwittingly caught in her web of deceit. The woman they loved and the horrible crimes she committed were now inseparably linked, challenging their notions of forgiveness and the very foundations of their understanding of right and wrong. She confessed to poisoning Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, John Henry Lee, her mother Lillian, and her boyfriend Stewart Taylor. Despite the fact that arsenic was found in Jennings Barfield's body, Velma denied killing him. The motive for the murders was stealing money from her victims to support her clandestine addiction to prescription drugs. She had also taken out a loan in her mother's name. Each of her tragic choices, made under the influence of pain, had a devastating impact on her destiny and the people around her. Faced with the threat of exposure, Velma took a step that irrevocably altered the course of her life. The path from one crime to another can often be a slippery slope. She found herself repeating the unthinkable. Every time, Velma went to her victims' funerals and seemed to sincerely mourn their loss. The burden of her secret pushed her further into isolation. Yet, the resilient human psyche, adept at self-preservation, often takes refuge in justification to shield itself from the unbearable truth and finds ways to rationalize even the darkest deeds. Every time Velma stole money from her victims, then poisoned them as they got suspicious. To the outside world, she remained a devout churchgoer, a seemingly caring nurse, and a loving family member. But her moral compass, once guided by faith, now veered into a realm of denial, caught in a constant struggle between the remnants of her conscience and the overwhelming desire to escape the consequences of her actions. She was forging checks on her boyfriend Stewart Taylor's account. Presumably, he discovered that. So she mixed an arsenic-based rat poison into his beer and tea, determined to maintain her secret at any cost. At the trial, Velma's defense pleaded insanity, but this was not accepted. She appeared cold and uncaring. She laughed at the prosecutor and even gave the district attorney a round of applause after his closing speech. The prosecution painted a picture of Velma not as the church-going grandmother she purported to be, but as a calculating murderer driven by darkness. She was the architect of her own fate, and her actions deserved the utmost penalty. The defense, in turn, sought to humanize her, portraying her not as a monster, but as a troubled soul ensnared by addiction, abuse, and circumstances beyond her control, highlighting her mental health struggles as a mitigating factor in her crimes. In the world of law and order, the truth is often more complex than it appears, inseparable from human emotions. Although she eventually confessed to 6 murders, she was convicted only of the first-degree murder of Stuart Taylor in December 1978. The trial jury found aggravating circumstances and sentenced her to death. For the victims' families, the verdict was an acknowledgement of their irreplaceable loss. A designated holding area for female death row prisoners did not exist at the time, and Velma was the only female death row inmate in North Carolina. So, she was imprisoned at Central Prison in Raleigh, in an area for escape-prone prisoners and prisoners with mental illnesses. Subsequently, a unit for female death row inmates was established at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. While on death row, Velma was off the drugs and expressed remorse for the years that the pills had blurred her judgment and destroyed her moral compass. In the solitude of her cell, she began the arduous process of confronting her past. The nights were long, the faces of her victims haunted her dreams, and the silence served as a backdrop for her thoughts and regrets. It was during these moments of reflection that Velma faced the full magnitude of her actions, the lives she had taken, and the pain she had caused. Her conversations with the prison chaplain were not just about seeking forgiveness from a higher power, but about understanding the nature of atonement and the painstaking process of forgiving oneself. In jail, Velma confessed that she had never been a true Christian. Her Christianity had been a matter of form and gesture. Then, finally, while waiting for her trial, she genuinely opened her heart to Jesus and received forgiveness and salvation. She wrote in her autobiography, "All my life I was weighted down by my sins because I couldn't do better. It never occurred to me that Jesus really did pay the price, that Jesus alone bore the extreme punishment, death, for my sins, not just for my good neighbors. And even more glorious, Jesus is willing to be my friend even now. I can talk to him and he will listen." She became a devout Christian and spent her 6 final years ministering to other inmates. Velma, in her own way, became a source of support to them. Her involvement in spiritual activities offered her a sense of community and belonging that had eluded her for much of her life. Her extensive participation in the Christian community led to a campaign to have her sentence commuted from death to life imprisonment. She wrote letters to Governor Jim Hunt telling him that her born-again Christian faith should be considered as a mitigating factor. She received support from many Christians across the United States, including evangelists Billy and Ruth Graham. Ruth kept in touch with Velma by mail. Her victims' families, however, considered Velma's conversion a fraud and a ploy to save her life. To them, she was a woman who had killed their loved ones. Velma remained a loving mother and a caring grandmother. She enjoyed family visits every weekend and spent time with her children and grandchildren. Her new attorney, Richard Burr, said about her, "The person I saw was kind, sensitive, and loving. There was no hidden agenda with Velma. Whenever you were with her, she was who she was. From what I understand, that's how she lived her life in prison. So, from the very beginning, I believed that when she committed those crimes, it was not the Velma Barfield mentally and emotionally that I was seeing and getting to know." Burr believed that Velma's pretrial evaluations were inadequate, so he turned to psychiatrist Selwyn Rose. Dr. Rose evaluated Velma in 1980 and testified in the state court. He said that she suffered from 3 disorders: a multiple prescription drug abuse disorder, an underlying personality disorder, and depression. However, Dr. Rose never felt as if he had put together a complete picture of Velma. As Burr had no license to practice in North Carolina, he now assisted Velma's new lawyer, Jimmy Little. As time was running out, Velma's son, Ronnie Burke, asked her if she had killed his father. She replied, "I'm sure I probably did." She couldn't remember clearly, but she believed that she had left a cigarette or a match in the bed and then closed the door, leaving her drunk husband to sleep in their burning house. She also admitted to the pastor who helped her write Woman on Death Row that she had murdered Jennings Barfield. Velma said she was glad that this was finally over because she was afraid that she was going to poison her grandchildren. She didn't know why she did it, but she did it, and it was not something she could stop. North Carolina's governor refused Velma's request for clemency and said that her victims had been literally tortured to death. Additionally, an appeal was made based on testimony from a psychiatry professor who asserted that she suffered from dissociative identity disorder. Professor Dorothy Lewis, professor of psychiatry at New York University School of Medicine and an expert in violent behavior, picked up patterns of manic episodes in Velma's earlier life associated with the development of a manic depressive disorder. She said she had talked to Velma's other personality, Billy, who told her Velma had been a victim of sexual abuse and that he, Billy, had killed her abusers. The judge responded to this by saying, "One of them did it. I don't care which one." Velma's final appeal was filed on October 30th, 1984, in the North Carolina Supreme Court, based on her being incompetent at her original trial due to her drug addiction. This appeal was denied in federal court. She told her attorney, Jimmy Little, to drop all appeals the day before she was executed, explaining that she wanted to die with as much dignity as the state of North Carolina will allow. Her last hours were spent in reflection and prayer, seeking comfort in her faith. As she was preparing for death, the famous pastor Billy Graham told her over the phone, "Velma, in a way I envy you because you're going to get to heaven before I do." Velma was executed on November 2nd, 1984, at Central Prison in Raleigh. She released a statement before her execution. "I want to say that I am sorry for all the hurt that I have caused. I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry, and I want to thank everybody who has been supporting me all these 6 years. I want to thank my family for standing with me through all this, and my attorneys and all the support to me, everybody, the people with the prison department. I appreciate everything, their kindness and everything that they have shown me during these 6 years." As her last meal, she chose a bag of cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. She received final visits from her family members and friends. She wasn't scared and told one of them, "When I go into that gas chamber at 2 a.m., it's my gateway to heaven." She was wearing pink pajamas for the execution. A stethoscope and heart monitor were taped to her chest. The wheeled gurney was brought to her cell, and she was fastened to it with straps across her body and legs. Then she was wheeled into the execution chamber shortly before 2 a.m. Crowds of pro- and anti-death penalty demonstrators gathered outside the prison. Some of the protesters accused Governor Hunt of refusing to show mercy and compassion, arguing that she could lead a life of value behind bars and help other prisoners. Richard Burr said, "Politics and death have been mixed up in this case." Inmates were banging rhythmically on the windows of their cells, waiting for the execution. About 80 people who were in favor of capital punishment cheered and applauded. The execution was carried out by 3 volunteers. One of the intravenous lines was a dummy, so that none of the volunteers knew which of them actually administered the lethal dose. Velma was declared dead at 2:15 a.m., 15 minutes after being administered the injection of procuronium bromide. Observers at the execution reported that she passed away peacefully, with no apparent suffering or pain. About 300 opponents of the death penalty stood in silent vigil, carrying candles that were extinguished as the moment of the execution passed. At 2:25 a.m., Velma's body was taken to a medical school by an ambulance. She had requested that her organs be used for transplantation. She was buried in a small North Carolina cemetery near her first husband, Thomas Burke. She was 52 years old. Singer-songwriter Jonathan Byrd, the grandson of Jennings Barfield and his first wife, wrote a song about Velma. Do you believe Velma should have been granted a life sentence because of her religious conversion? Or did she deserve the execution? And what would your last meal be? Tell me in the comments.